Hello, good morning. Welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna episode 179. Still going. My name is Lorna Steele-McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service, which has 4 archive centres across the Highlands of Scotland in Inverness, Fort William, Portree and Wick. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland's a charity registered in Scotland and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in the Learn with Lorna series. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we are very, very grateful for that. There's a link to be able to do so in the body of the text, in the first comment, and also if you're watching on YouTube, a link within that text as well. So thank you very much if you are in a position to be able to support us. So welcome to this week. We are looking at stories of import, export, trade and smuggling. And I found once again, while writing this episode, that it was utterly fascinating. And sometimes I kind of create these titles where I'll find stories to fit into that overview title. And then as I start researching it, I get more and more absorbed into different stories. This episode was much more dramatic than I expected. So be prepared for stories of riots and smuggling and voyages. The definition of import and export is very simple. This is the bringing of goods into the country or the sale of goods out of the country. And so that, of course, took me into records to do with shipping, merchants and trade. And I will come to look at that trade between nations shortly, but I wanted to start just by really giving an idea of the scale of shipping, the shipping trade that was happening in and around the Highlands, and the sheer amount of goods and produce that were coming in and out of our ports, which is completely staggering, both for a domestic market and for an international market. And I think I've said before that, in my opinion, and you may feel free to disagree with me, I think that we forget the sheer volume of travel and business that was done by sea in the past. I mean, we look at sort of ships leaving our ports to go overseas, particularly around carrying immigrants and things like that. But it seems to me that most stretches of our coastline would have been bustling with small boats, with larger ships, moving people and goods, both long distances but also very short distances. So we see frequently that people travel down a few miles of the coast rather than travelling inland because it was easier. So in our family and estate collections, we can see loads of references to this, either to taking voyages and journeys. Off the top of my head, if you listen to the episode on Anne Fraser's diary, we talk particularly about that, but also numerous descriptions of shipping goods around the coast. So this is an example. This is from the Baillie of Dunane collection. So within a bundle of invoices and receipts that the family were paying for. An advert. At Leith for Cromarty and Inverness, the Inverness and Leith Shipping Company smack Forth, with Alexander MacLeod master. The Forth is now on the berth, so the ship is in berth in Leith, opposite to Mr. Black's tobacconist on the shore, taking in goods deliverable at the above ports. It will be cleared out on the 17th current and will have excellent accommodation for passengers, freight or passage. So a pretty standard advert, but then underneath it, it really details how, like I say, how much trade is happening in and around the coastline. So it says, Citadel Leith, 15th of August 1821. We'll be leaving and calling for Cromarty, first port, where we will deliver goods there for Tain, Milton, Invergordon, Bridge of Alness, Dingwall, Dornoch, Helmsdale, Inver, Ullapool, etc. And then Inverness as the second port, with goods delivered there for Fort George, Nairn, Campbellton, Cawdor, Fortrose, Redcastle, Bewley, Fort Augustus, Muirton, Arkin, Fenelon, etc., etc. So, and that is just one example of numerous ships that were kind of plying this trade up and down the coast. In that particular instance, we know that the Baillies put 2 trunks and 2 boxes on it, because on the other side of that is their receipt for paying for that service. So, loads of ships going about. I went, of course, next to the wonderful Timber Fraser Merchants collection. I've done a previous Learn with Lorna episode on this collection. If you haven't caught up with it, do try and have a look, because it's the most extraordinary collection, and my desperate hope is that one day someone will come in and tell me that they've got 2 years and £10,000 and they want to do nothing but research this collection. That would be brilliant. So I went to Alexander Fraser Timber Merchants, and I was once again astonished by the amount of sea-bound trade visible within those papers. Bundles and bundles and bundles of letters, receipts and invoices from the 1700s and 1800s, showing ships leaving Inverness bound for really everywhere you can think of on the coast, including a load of places I had to look up because I have never heard of them. But bound for Lerwick, for Halifax, London, Glasgow, Hull, so right across the UK, but then also further afield to Rotterdam and various other European destinations. And this one collection just gives so much information about businesses, about projects, about people, not just in the Highlands but beyond. And these ships that are going out from this company are carrying timber, props, wool and a whole load of other goods. And you get a glimpse through this of good and bad trade times. So for instance, we see letters like this one. This one was written by George Forster at the Headon Colliery outside Newcastle. Dear Sir, I received yours dated on the 13th and the 22nd inst with a cargo of props on board the Industry, so he's saying we've received this cargo, but not impressed with it. He says, what to make of this timber I really cannot tell, as it seems so small it cannot be sold. One half of it is fit for nothing but props, and I'm surprised that you haven't converted it into props. I thought this the best way to acquaint you of it. The Betsy and the Industry's cargo of props is very inferior cargoes. They are all sap rotten. The price that we cannot give you for these two cargoes, as we can get them delivered at a cheaper rate elsewhere. So he says it's impossible to give you any more because we can get any quantity at this price from your old friend John Humble and from others. He goes on to say that the a ship has come in to South Shields, has come up to load, and that so far they've bought 26 barrels of tar. And he goes on to say that Scotch timber at the moment is so very plentiful that it can't be sold anywhere. So that's just one example. Another one, a little bit more positive about the Fraser Timber Merchants' sea trade, comes from Pulteneytown in 1815. Sir, will you have the goodness to send me by my sloop that is in your place just now 6,000 feet of plaster lath wood of the best you have. You can send the account by the sloop, and you can draw on me 3 months, or the money will be sent as soon as convenient. Please also ask the master to call at the new foundry for some cast iron, for Mr. John Sinclair here. I got this. I forgot to ask for it when the sloop came to Inverness, but I'll get on the way back instead. So just some little insights into the amount of trade that's happening around the coast. Alexander Fraser Timber Merchants, as I mentioned, are not just trading internally, they're exporting and importing from other countries. I was really intrigued by one letter from 31st of August 1815, sent from a correspondent in London, in which the writer tells John Fraser, Alexander Fraser's son, that he's been unable to lay his hands on any butter scrapings, and that prices are very high at the moment because of the current cost of Irish butter, but that he has been able to get hold of palm oil, which he will send on to Inverness. And I think that's a good example of so many of these products that I'm talking about, like the Irish butter or the palm oil. We get a glimpse of their journey as a product from our collections, but they will have come in from across the world or be going on to other countries. You know, I would absolutely imagine that the palm oil has come from elsewhere. And we see evidence of that within the Fraser Timber Merchants collection. So for instance, again from 1815, there's a list of the export prices on items coming in from Danzig or Gdansk. Everything from grains and woods to linens, ashes and feathers. Really interesting that feathers is one of the things that has a specific reference. And it includes some very interesting commentary. And I was struck by how relevant it is, as I have often said in this series, how relevant archives still are, from hundreds of years ago to today. So this particular document includes some insights into the way that conflict and war and politics can impact what a country is able to export and what they're not able to export, the impact that that has on the population and on the trade of that country. So in this case, we're talking about Poland. So that price list from Gdansk, giving the prices to import feathers and wood and so on, has a description of what the state of trade is, and this is how it opens. Danzig, 11th of July 1815. Since our last general advice of the 6th of February, we have had no inducement for continuing the same, as the unfortunate crisis which was brought about by the reappearance of Bonaparte chiefly put a stop to trade. But thanks to Providence, the plans of this tyrant are frustrated, and our commerce will no doubt soon revive. Our stock of wheat is trifling, as the supplies were stopped by the exportation being prohibited in Poland by the Russian government. But as we have received information that the prohibition has now been taken off, we still expect 10 to 12,000 lasts will be brought down before the end of the season, which, and with the appearance of a promising harvest, will enable us to make reasonable purchases. The present prices are for ordinary quality 390 to 395, and for good heavy mixed heavy wheat 420 to 425. The supply of rye is likewise very small, for the same reason as that of wheat, and several purchases which were lately made by government have lessened it still more. As, however, exportation is now again permitted in Poland, prices have fallen 30 per last, and on the arrival of further supplies must go still lower, so that in a few weeks we will expect to see the price of this article at 220 to 230. Of barley, oats and peas, the supplies are also very moderate, but they will likewise increase and prices be reduced as the armies start to be provided for elsewhere. I was just really struck by how relevant that is to a lot of what we have seen on the news in the last few years around what can and can't be exported from a country in a situation of conflict and the impact that that has on global trade. But as well as trade going in and out of our ports, I was really fascinated, something that I didn't expect to come across, when I was looking at the Caledonian Canal records. There are lists produced which record all the ships travelling through the Caledonian Canal in the 1820s, with details of their origin, their destination, their cargo, and the masters of the ships. And I got absolutely lost in them for a while, and then forced my colleagues to become absolutely lost in them too. So for instance, on the 23rd of June, I think it was 1824, the Gratitude of Dundee took a cargo of emigrants' luggage through the canal, loaded at Fort William, bound for Quebec. So it's a passing reference within a canal collection, just gives a glimpse into such a big part of our history. We see in those canal shipping lists salmon for London, timber for Newcastle, but most noticeable to me, immediately jumped out to me, is the vast amount of herring from Helmsdale, Fraserburgh, Staxigo, Banff, and of course Wick. And of course it doesn't surprise me at all to see herring being exported from those ports. But what was striking was that they were bound particularly for Ireland. So Dublin, Sligo, Drogheda, Coleraine, Newry, Waterford, Belfast, Cork, the majority of those cargo shipments going to Ireland. It's been estimated that about 2/3 of the poorest quality salted herring exported from Scotland in the late 18th century went to the West Indies to feed enslaved people. It provided a basic level of protein enough to keep people alive and working, but not providing the best quality. Anyone who's interested in following that up should have a look at David Alston's work, Slaves and Highlanders. But our ports in the north were involved in that to such an extent that when moves were made to abolish slavery and emancipate enslaved people, merchants, fish merchants in Wick, Cromarty and Tain petitioned Parliament about it. Ships going to the Caribbean often mustered in Cork before then travelling in convoy to the West Indies. So perhaps those herring that were going through the Caledonian Canal were bound for the slave plantations of the Caribbean. And of course, Wick's export of herring generally is one of the biggest examples of export in Highland history. The wonderful Wick Harbour Trust records, which I have certainly spoken about before, held at Nucleus, our archive centre in Wick, date from 1829 through to 1990. And we can see in these records not only the herring boom and the herring trade, but also evidence of other produce and products and goods coming in and out of Wick port. The ledgers show the names of ships, their cargoes, their tonnage rates, the tonnage rates that were due, and the import dues, because of course all of this comes with a whole world of taxes involved in import and export. It's interesting to look through the rates lists to get an idea of the sort of products and goods that were coming through our ports, particularly, as I say, in this instance, the Wick. So we can see, like those herring potentially going to the Caribbean, like that export ban in Poland, we can see by looking at the ships of what's coming in and what they're bringing, gives us a bit of an idea about the wider context of the time. So we have a list from the 1880s that shows blubber being charged at 6 shillings 6 per 250 gallons. Later on, during the Second World War, blubber would be exempt from rationing, and so we would see that volume changing perhaps at that point. We see tricycles being imported with a due of 1 shilling each, blood of cattle at 1 shilling per tonne, asses and mules at 1 shilling each, and ferrets at 1p, which just created an image in my head of all these ferrets charging about the harbour at Wick and getting away. We can see dung at 4p per tonne, furrier's waste at 4p per tonne. And then of course we see evidence of the famous Caithness flagstones being exported. If we have a look at the brilliant AI welders collection, which again I've done an episode on, we can see the trade of welding equipment being produced here and then being exported out to Canada, to other countries. We've got evidence within the sales logs of it going to Australia, Canada, Singapore, all sorts of places. And then also some journals of the ship's journeys out to those areas. So trade has been constant, of course, in and out of our ports for centuries. But what about if something went wrong? What about if the export was controversial, or if someone didn't want to pay those duties, taxes and charges associated with trade? That's what we're going to spend the second half looking at. So let's have a look at the first of all, when exports are controversial. One of the best examples of this is the Caithness grain riots of 1847, which came in the midst of a Highland famine and right on the back, hard on the heels of the Irish famine. Very, very recent memory for everybody. The potato blight, which had absolutely decimated crops and the Irish food stock, also hit Caithness and other parts of the Highlands and Islands. And as a result of this loss of the potato crop, people started to turn to oatmeal as a replacement kind of staple basic food. And as they turned to oatmeal, of course, what happened? The prices rose. The price of grains rose as landlords, farmers and dealers sought instead to export that grain to achieve higher selling prices rather than selling locally and supporting the local community. And the corn laws, which have been the cause of so much discussion in the 19th century, you can't move for tripping over the corn laws in the 19th century, meant that fundamentally it meant that the import of cheap cereals and grains from other countries was forbidden because they were trying to boost the home market. And so that combination of local grain being exported elsewhere and not being allowed to bring in cheap grain from other countries kind of created a perfect storm of starvation and desperation. It wasn't that there was no food, it was just that the food wasn't being fairly allocated across the people that needed it. The John O'Groat Journal of the 12th of February 1847 said, "While they are starving, the granary lofts of the neighbourhood are groaning under the weight of thousands of quarters of oats and beer grains. raised to a famine price by undue competition and placed far beyond the capabilities of even the employed labouring classes. So again, like a few of the other things I've mentioned so far, like conflict impact, this is something else that's very familiar to us. The concept of there being enough for everyone if everyone has a little, rather than a few getting a lot. And hunger and desperation and this sense of injustice led to riots breaking out, with vast crowds gathering in Thurso and Castle Hill and Wick to try and stop grain exports. They boarded cargo ships, they threatened crews, and shots were fired. And on the 17th of February 1847, a crowd blockaded Wick Harbour to try and prevent a shipment of grain leaving the harbour. And this is a description from one of our Nucleus blogs. If you want to read more about it, there's a whole range of blogs on the Nucleus website telling different stories, but this is an extract from that. A crowd blockaded the harbour entrance and filled the boat that was to take the grain with stones. The Riot Act was read, but the crowd refused to disperse. There was a standoff over the weekend, and then on the following Monday, a company of over 100 soldiers arrived by steamer from Aberdeen. Under the protection of their rifles, the boat was loaded with grain late on the afternoon of Wednesday the 24th, and a squad of soldiers was stationed to guard the quay overnight. A crowd gathered and began to taunt the soldiers, some throwing stones. And then sharing an extract from Jim Hunter's brilliant book, which I can recommend to anybody who's interested in this. So heavy were some of those stones that one of them shattered the wooden stock of a soldier's musket. Others, thrown with great violence, curving down from high above, inflicted injury after injury on men whose progress was thus brought to a halt. I was struck by stones several times, said Corporal Cormac Dowd, who had his head cut through his cap. My arm was black from a severe blow, said Private John Carr. A stone knocked a firelock from my grasp, said Private Richard Broom. The stones were rattling on our bayonets, said Private Daniel Connery. I was hit between the shoulders with a large stone which knocked me flat to the ground. When I got the blow, I said I would stand this no longer, and it was as good to kill another as for oneself to be killed. With the situation escalating, the guard called for reinforcements, and the streets were cleared in a bayonet charge. 3 people were arrested, and the soldiers marched them off to jail. Their route took them along Union Street, at the foot of the brae that runs along Sinclair Terrace, where the library stands today. Another jeering crowd collected along the top of the brae and soon started throwing stones down on the soldiers passing below. The sheriff ordered the soldiers to open fire up the brae into the crowd. A young woman whose name was McGregor was hit on the arm, but not seriously, while William Hogston had his hand shattered by musket fire. The John O'Groat Journal reported that William Hogston, who was a cooper by trade, had been making his way quietly home when he was caught in the firing. His hand was so mutilated that the fingers had to be amputated, and with his means of making a living gone, with a wife and 5 children, he had no alternative than to approach the Poor Relief Board, the parochial board, for support, which, as the minutes tell us, was granted at a rate of 5 shillings per week. Thank goodness that, thank goodness that happened to him, I don't mean that at all, but thank goodness it happened to him when it did, because if it happened a couple of years earlier, there would have been no poor relief system to step in and support him. It's interesting to note that the minutes of the Commissioners of Supply, this was an organisation or a section of people specifically set up for collecting taxes, but by this point in time, they are local landowners, predominantly representing the landowning classes, and they are collecting tax. And the minutes of the Commissioner's Supply give the opinion that there was plenty of grain without the need for import, but acknowledge that most of this will be sent away from this area. They say here there is not so much a deficiency of food as of money for its purchase. Interesting, because they then say there is no very pressing destitution in this country. It makes you wonder what the difference is between there's plenty of food, but if you can't afford to buy that food, how different is that to you? These riots weren't contained only to Caithness. There was unrest right across the Highlands and Islands as a result of this, motivated by the pressing risk of famine which had just been witnessed across the water. And the unrest did lead to cheaper food over subsequent months, and also to firmer commitments to assist the feeding of the public in times of crisis. But it illustrates that exports can be incredibly incendiary. People can have very strong feelings about what is sent out the country and what is brought into the country. And so finally, what happens when people ignore all those official processes and decide to move goods in and out of the country illegally? We have loads and loads of references to smuggling within our collections, and also to the customs and excise officers whose role was to prevent the smuggling, in addition to the other things they were responsible for. And again, if you're interested in following that up, Learn with Lorna 107 looked at customs and excise. Many of these documents relate to the original definition of the word smuggling, which literally is just referring to the illicit distilling of particularly whisky. So mostly when you see smuggling, there's no movement of anything, it's just illicit distilling. But some do relate to the illegal import and export of goods, which we can see from the statistical accounts was at one time very common. So this is from the statistical account, the first account, 1794, of Kilmuir in Ross and Cromarty. There is one large cave in this parish at a place called Craigenchow. Craigenchow is how it's written, a name given for its very famous echo, at the entrance of the Bay of Munlochy. The cave is very large and reaches far into the rock, so far indeed that the farmers in the neighbourhood were obliged to shut it up towards the hill with rubbish, for when their sheep and goats strayed into it, they were never seen or heard of again. The mouth of the cave was made up with stone and lime several years ago by traders who secured and secreted smuggled goods in it, but since that contraband trade has been abolished on this coast, the masonwork is fallen to decay. But the cave could easily contain, I am told, a whole ship's cargo. It's very evocative description, I think. It's much more reminiscent of Cornwall or somewhere else on the coast. So we know that smuggling was happening. It's very interesting. Going through the first statistical account, loads of references. Then by the second statistical account in the 1840s, 30s, they reference the fact that it's no longer as common as it was. And our court records include references to smuggling goods in from abroad from the 1600s onwards. There's a 1699 case of smuggling 19 casks of brandy from France on the ship the Elizabeth of Findhorn. In the same year, there's a complaint against the brilliantly named Captain Job Arian, whose crew offered violence when approached after taking 2 small casks off their ship. From 1701, I was reading a complaint against Donald Grant, Alexander Mackay, John Henderson, Thomas Aves, merchants of Inverness, and James Keeloch, master of the Janet of Inverness, for importing liquor contrary to the Act of Parliament, which I think is the 1700 Taxation Act. So, for instance, that act meant that duty should be paid to the Crown. So they've brought it in without doing that. And they had apparently brought into the country from Holland 4 half hogsheads of Bieriger. Now, after much flipping time spent Googling and searching different databases and dictionaries and so on, I have learned that Bieriger is a type of vinegar made by fermenting beer. There was also Aleger. So there you go. So they had brought in these casks of Bieriger, and the ship, as a result of this illegal action, the ship was put up for public roup, so it was put to an auction at the toll booth in Inverness as a penalty for this behaviour. And it's not just about alcohol. There's an intriguing document from 1706 that shows the illegal import of what I think says lettered dials from abroad. Helen Bailey in 1712 seems to have been accused of importing a whole range of things from Holland on the Lion of Leith, which I didn't have time to go into. So if you want to investigate that further, come in and have a look at Helen Bailey's court papers from 1711. I'll maybe share an extract of some of these things after I've finished speaking as well. And then in 1760, the controller of HM Customs at Inverness started a process against John Shand, merchant of Garmouth, after the ship the Shepherd of Spey, captained by John McCarty, was seized and found to contain the following from Holland: 34 hogsheads of red wine, 4 casks of snuff, 9 casks of licorice ball, 1 cask of coffee, 1 cask of currants, 2 casks of black pepper, 10 casks of hard soap and 1 cask of soft soap, 103 quarter weight of battery, and 500 weight of ironware. Quite an amount to be bringing in and be caught for, I thought. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, they're stories of everyday life. These are stories of business and industry and trade and our ports and our kind of maritime history, but also these are dramatic stories of wars, of conflict, of oppression, starvation, smuggling, the impact that all of those things have on the life of the people here and further afield. So I hope you've enjoyed that wee look into import and export stories. Like I say, I found it even more fascinating than I thought I would. Next week we will be moving to the southwest of the area that we cover and telling stories from Fort William. So I hope you can join me next week as well. I'll leave it a little bit of time and then I will add up some of those documents I've been talking about today, just so you can have a look. You can see why I didn't spend this morning looking at the Helen Bailey document. You'll see that will be very apparent. So I hope you've enjoyed that. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you again next week. A reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're really grateful for that. Thank you.